When we design our experiment, we have to think through several factors, including our variables and our control conditions. We need to decide how many replicates we're going to use, how we will control our experiment, what measurements to take, and how we want to take good notes. Let's start with variables. Independent variables are essentially our experimental conditions that we're using to influence our dependent variables. By varying our independent variables, we expect to see a response in our dependent variables to that change. Our dependent variables are going to be those things that we measure through our experiment to see how our independent variables are influencing them. For example, our independent variable may be temperature or amount of light or light intensity, whereas our dependent variable will be plant growth and survival. So we will control our light levels or our temperature, and we will measure our plant growth. When you identify your independent and dependent variables, you will need to be sure that you can effectively measure both. Your dependent variables should be measurable effects of changes in your independent variables. These measurements will be the data that you record and analyze to see if your hypothesis is supported. We use the concept of control to hold some independent variables constant while changing the independent variables that we are interested in. This may mean that in a behavioral study, you only have participants in a single age group, controlling for age, or only a particular gender, controlling for gender. Some conditions that can be controlled include age, gender, temperature, light exposure, construction material, among others. Where possible, we will want to have control replicates that act as a baseline to compare changes in independent variables to. If, for example, we are testing the effects of the liquid we water plants with, we may choose to water some of the plants with tap water as a control to compare other liquids to. If we're testing the effect of watching TV on concentration, we would test without watching TV to compare our results. The control is often chosen as the standard conditions, like tap water for irrigation or room temperature for temperature. Now let's talk about replicates. We understand that the response of dependent variables to changes in independent variables is not always consistent. To account for that variability and for potential error, we set up experimental replicates. Replicates repeat the same experimental conditions to see if the results are repeatable. This allows you to make conclusions with more confidence and to identify potential sources of error. The more variable the system, the more you will need. For example, in chemistry, you may need fewer than in plant sciences, where you may need fewer than in behavioral sciences. 3 to 5 replicates of the same experimental conditions is a good starting point. When doing behavioral science research, often more subjects are needed to make good conclusions. Before you start your experiments, you will want to set up your notebook to record your data. To organize your note-taking, you will want to make a data table where you can record your experimental conditions or independent variables, with space to record your measurements or dependent variables. Keeping detailed notes is a key part of the scientific process. As you plan your experiments, you will decide upon your independent variables, dependent variables, control conditions, replicates, and how you will measure and record your data. Your experimental plan should be focused on your hypothesis in answering your research question. Happy experimenting!